Chapter 22. Tuesday morning early. The morning dawned bright and clear. Doreen groaned with relief. She'd done it. She'd taken yesterday off completely, as per her agreement with Mac. She still wasn't sure how he'd gotten her agreement, but he had. Now that torment was over. She had a bright, cheerful grin on her face as she hopped out of bed with energy to spare. As she thought about it in the shower, she wondered if having the day off had helped. She'd taken the whole day to rest and to relax, forcing herself to ignore everything, at least as much as she could. And she'd slept well and now felt wonderfully refreshed. She groaned. But that would mean Mac was right. Something she could never let him know. As it was, her day of rest allowed her to finally recover from the antiques, the gardening, and the heavy sorting and cleaning of her house. Although, as she realized from her most recent visit with Nan, she still had to go through the paperwork in those 2 bundles. Or 4 bundles. She mentally chastised herself for already trying to cut the work in half. But then she was grinning madly as she stepped out of the shower, dried off and got dressed. It was all waiting for her, so yay. The animals were all waiting for her too. So what do you guys think? What's on our plate today? Muggs woofed and jumped, then went to her, looking for a cuddle. Goliath stared at them in disdain. Thaddeus, on the other hand, wandered up and down the stairway railing, waiting for them to go downstairs. She led the way, only to have Goliath streak ahead and Muggs chase after him. She was chuckling by the time she hit the kitchen. She disarmed the security and opened the doors to the backyard. Everybody ran out except for her. She was more interested in getting coffee on first. Nothing like that very first cup of a day. Then, with the coffee dripping, she grabbed a pad of paper and a pencil and stepped onto the deck and sat down in the early morning sunshine. It was already 8 o'clock. Somehow, her early morning had not been as early as she had originally thought. Keeping an eye on the animals wandering through the garden beds, sniffing out whatever critters might have come through the place during the night, she wrote down a to-do list. She would get her car emptied today. She had gone through a few more of the clothes she had originally thought to keep, and collected another full bag she would give to Wendy to sell on consignment, so she wanted to add that to the other bags going to Wendy already in her car. She also needed to get some more groceries. Muggs's dog food was looking a little sad. With that thought, she hopped up to feed the animals. When they heard the bags shaking, they came running. She laughed and said, "You guys are fed now, but I'm not sure about me." She opened the fridge to see a pretty dismal-looking selection. The leftover pork chop was long gone. While she looked inside, she realized she had enough for the always good old standby, a cheese omelet. And as much as she loved them, it was time to add a couple other foods to her morning repertoire. She could try scrambling the eggs, but thought she'd end up with something either too liquid in form or overcooked. So it was an omelet once again. She poured herself her first cup of coffee, and then made her omelet and took both out onto the deck. A text came through from Mac. "How did yesterday go?" "Perfect." "Did you rest and leave all the cases alone?" "Yes. I hate to say it, but I'm feeling much more energized and alive today." That made her laugh. She was in such a benevolent mood, she realized she owed Mac more than she could ever thank him for, just for teaching her a few things. And that was besides learning she needed to take some downtime. She was a long way from doing much cooking, but adding even an omelet to her skill set had been huge. She really wanted spaghetti again, but the thought of making that sauce all on her own was daunting. She frowned, thinking about it. If she bought the ingredients, maybe this week Mac would stand by while she made it. She pulled out her phone and asked him. When the text came back and with a solid block cap yes, she figured he was perfectly happy with that idea. And then wondered what she needed for ingredients. She walked back inside and picked up previous notes from her cooking lessons. and came back outside. She brought her laptop with her this time. She looked at her notes and saw she had most of it, but wasn't sure if it was all. He'd gotten a little sneaky, adding in things like wine when she wasn't around. She opened an email, copied over everything she thought went into the recipe, and sent it off to him with a question about whether or not she needed anything else. She didn't expect to get an answer right away, since he should be at work, and she had certainly dumped enough work on his plate over the weekend. That reminded her of another stop she wanted to make. She frowned at that because she could take the animals with her to both Wendy's and the thrift store, but she couldn't take them to the grocery store or to the library. Not to mention the car was overstuffed. And she really wanted to get some of this done. The animals appeared to be content on the back deck. Only now did she realize that taking down the rear fence meant she could no longer keep Muggs secured inside her yard. And Goliath, well, nothing would keep him or Thaddeus in. Muggs was generally quite happy to just stay in the backyard, but she didn't want somebody coming in and hurting him. She frowned and wondered what she was supposed to do. Taking the fence down had been a good idea, but she needed to put something else up. Or even just expand the deck and put a gate on it. She loved that idea. She got up and wandered around, looking at the deck. It was pretty narrow and long, but there wasn't much grass growing on the left side of the house. So if she extended the deck enough for a table and maybe even a little barbecue, she could gate it by the steps, and then Muggs couldn't wander the yard and creak whenever he wanted. She nodded to herself and wrote down another note about looking for plans. She figured that it would be cheaper to do it herself than to hire somebody. Still, it wouldn't necessarily be easy. She wasn't sure she was quite up for it yet. Something simpler first, perhaps. Still, she brightened. "I do have the tools," she said with a laugh. But she put away that thought. After she was done eating, she put the animals back in the house, locked the door, set the security, and grabbed the last bag of clothes for Wendy, plus an armload of coats. She got into her car and headed out. Driving carefully past the few remaining media who flashed cameras in her face, she gave them a bright wave and drove off. She started her errands by dropping off all the charity stuff first. Delighted Mac was right when several young men did come out and unloaded the car for her. She was tempted to give them the bag and the coats for Wendy too, but then figured that, at least with Wendy's consignment, Doreen might get some money for those items. With that thought in mind, she headed to the consignment shop, parked outside the front door and walked in just as Wendy unlocked the door. Wendy smiled at her, seeing the armload of coats and the single big black garbage bag, and said, "Are you finally getting to the end of it?" Doreen nodded. "This is a bag of stuff I was thinking I would keep, but as I tried them on, I didn't really like what it did for me. So there could be a few more of these, because I did keep quite a bit on the first pass. And of course I brought the coats I don't want too." "Let me grab them," Wendy said as they walked into the back. They hung the items on hangers. Wendy nodded. "These are excellent quality. I don't think I'll have any trouble selling them." Delighted, Doreen said goodbye and drove to the library. She was planning to do the grocery store first, but then thought that was foolish, because everything would sit in the car while she was doing her research. Inside, she escaped the librarian's notice because she was busy dealing with other customers. She headed to the back to the computer and the microfiche film. She wasn't sure this was the best place, but of course, Bob Small was somebody she wanted to get some older history on. And then she had those 6 boxes in her living room from the Hope Chest to research the even earlier years. She rolled through the films as far back as she could, but Veronica wasn't showing up in the year Doreen was looking at. And there were hundreds of microfiche rolls, so she needed to narrow it down. Frowning, she couched that and started on Bob Small. There were tons from 10, 20, even 30 years ago. She wondered if he was alive now. But nothing said definitively he was the serial killer, although he had been questioned several times. So he was a person of interest, but they never had any proof. which made him a very good serial killer, and she hated that she could even think that, because why should anybody be a good killer? That was just so wrong. She sorted through Steve's articles online next, looking for the arson articles. And then realized they were too recent for the microfiches, and so she switched to the computers. She should be doing this at home really, because then she could print stuff off for free. She hesitated and decided she was probably much better off doing this at home, because these were public computers. Plus, for all she knew, the librarian could check the history of whatever she did when she was here. On that note, she cleared her cache, grabbed her notepad, and left the library, ignoring the librarian who called out to her. She drove to the grocery store. That stop was much harder. By the time she had everything on her list for the spaghetti sauce, it looked suspiciously large and expensive. She had many of the ingredients at home, just not enough of some of them. She grabbed the regular things she needed, alongside the pet food, and frowned to see the bill would be a lot larger than normal. She still hadn't picked up any other meat. And she did need more. She grabbed cans of tuna and some cheese, then picked up deli meats for sandwiches. She didn't have a clue on how Mac had done those pork chops either. So she walked past the pork chops and wondered just how hard it would be to cook a chicken breast. Not wanting to take the chance, she grabbed a rotisserie chicken and figured that would hold her for a couple days. The bill made her gulp, but she bravely pulled out her wallet and paid for it. Inside though, she was shaky and worried that even trying to eat properly would wipe out her bank account. But then she remembered all the money she'd made off the car parts, the extra money Nan had given her for a dump run, and her recent bowl of money at home, and she knew she'd be okay for a while. Back home, she unloaded everything, with Muggs more than slightly interested in the ground beef she had bought for the spaghetti sauce and the roast chicken as well. She gently moved him out of the way so she could get everything free and clear of him, and where it all belonged. She was almost done when her phone rang. She answered it, but nobody was on the other end. She frowned and looked at her screen to see it was an unknown caller. She hated those. If people made a phone call, they should at least be honest about who they were when calling. She put down her phone and sat back to continue her research. She should be going through the folders sitting off to the side, but her mind was stuck on Steve and those arson fires. By researching the individual names of the men who died in the fires, she found the same articles Solomon had printed off. But trying to find anything new wasn't fruitful. Then, if Solomon was a good journalist, all this info would likely be in his notes and the rest of the file. Plus, the journalist had access to things she didn't have. She pulled up the PDF file on Steve from Solomon and sorted through a bunch of it. She was tempted to print the whole dang thing as the file was so large. Plus, it would be easier to read some of this stuff in print form. She looked down at it and saw it was 77 pages long. She winced but decided to print off the notes at least. With that in hand, alongside a pen and her notepad, she did a timeline. The arson fires were all within 2 months, including the Helmsman fire. All in 2 months. Highly suspicious. According to what the journalist had noted, another gang was trying to move into town. The gangs were engaged in open warfare and had killed one gang member and had burned down his house. The Kelowna gang retaliated. 3 house fires and 3 other gang members killed made sense, particularly if they were leaders whose deaths would have completely disbanded the rival gang, and had the others in the gang either no longer involved or leaving town for better pastures. So 4 files. Doreen decided to add something to that note. 4 women paid off. But after reading that aloud, she sat back and wondered. What would be the purpose of paying off the women? Did the Devil Riders feel guilty, and did the women need this money? Or had the women helped kill the men, or at least knew something about it? It was all fascinating and confusing, but, as she read through Solomon's notes and articles, she found he had been extremely linear in his note-taking and had included damn near everything she needed. So what was the motive behind those checks? It made Steve look like a philanthropist, a good guy, if the checks came from his own account. So what she and Mac needed to do was find out if Steve had been reimbursed for those checks. That made sense to her, if he acted as corporate counsel to the Devil Riders. But she wondered what was required for the police to get a warrant to check out Steve's financials. She frowned, pondering the issue for a long time. She certainly didn't have that skill, and obviously the journalist hadn't gotten that far. He likely couldn't get access. And what would it matter if Steve had handed over those checks? Outside of the fact he could be a lawyer for the gang or the insurance company, it didn't really mean Steve was involved in anything criminal, which was what Mac had said earlier. It was obvious to her that Steve was involved in something criminal, but how did one prove it? Steve was too darn slippery. The fact he broke into her house and stole his own file was irritating too. The fact she told him all were scanned in meant he knew his attempt to steal all this information had failed. She wondered what his next move would be. If it was her, she would probably pack up and run, because there was no way to stop the digital files from spreading. Once digital, it was always digital, and it could go anywhere. Particularly to the police. And cloud storage meant even if he came back and stole her laptop, he couldn't remove all the copies she had. Of course, that didn't mean he wouldn't try that though. Doreen opened an email and sent copies of the folders to herself and to her new special email she had created earlier and didn't share with anyone else. Steve wouldn't have the logins for that, so she could always access it. Now who else could she send it to? Mac's brother, the lawyer. She frowned at that because she didn't really want to start dumping additional work on him, not when she couldn't even pay for the work he was doing for her. But he could be a good additional holding place. Then she decided to avoid that contact for the moment. Better she leave it all with Mac instead. Although Mac would need her to speak with his brother at some point, she'd push it back a day, a week, a month or two. But knew she couldn't push it too far. As she mused on what else to do with this information, she decided to put on a pot of tea. As she did, her mind wandered to Nan. She picked up the phone and called her. "Good morning, dear," Nan's bright voice answered on the other end. "Good morning, Nan," Doreen said with a chuckle. "Don't you sound fine this morning?" "I am indeed. It's a beautiful day. You've stirred up this place with new life. Now there's more gossip than ever. It's keeping me busy." "Too much so," Doreen said. "It's obvious Steve's been working for the Devil Riders gang for decades, but there's very little proof as to him having done any wrongdoing." "There will always be proof. You must dig a little deeper." "Right," she said. "I'm trying to locate the women who accepted the payouts, to find out why they were given them. But then it's not like anybody is still in town. At least not according to my research." "No, I wouldn't imagine so," Nan said. "If they were smart, they probably changed their names. Can you go down to the government office and find that information in public records?" "I'm not sure," Doreen said thoughtfully. "But there must be a database somewhere, and there's probably a fee." "Of course there is. The government will take money from you," Nan said. "I could ask around here if anyone might have known those women." "Or the men," Doreen said. "The ones who died might have left a bigger impression." "Oh yes, I see what you mean," Nan said. "Deaths are more shocking." "Really, does anybody consider the survivors?" "Exactly," Doreen said. "You've got such a wealth of history at your fingertips down there at Rosemore. I'm amazed." "Well, just think about it. Solomon is still alive too. Good for him. I wish he'd had more evidence collected. He gathered lots of information, and it's obvious in his summary he thinks Steve is heavily involved in money laundering. But how does one prove that? Solomon didn't collect enough to take to the police himself, so not sure I can either." "True," Nan said. I don't think I'll have a chance to talk to him. I don't know. I hope you will. I certainly won't, Doreen said. So, ask away and see if anybody knows anything about it. Then before she hung up, she said, Nan? Yes, dear. Be careful. With that done, she put Steve's name on the new physical file folder and copied off the summary and her page of notes, then put it back into Solomon's file boxes. Between the 4 boxes of Solomon's case files and the 6 hope chest boxes, she was running out of room in that big front closet. She grabbed bundles of paperwork that Nan had kept on the shelves here, thinking they were by year, only to realize they were a complete jumble. She groaned, cleaned off the kitchen table and opened the smallest of the bundles. Then she sorted the receipts and the household maintenance documents, like insurance. She stared at the insurance, shook her head and whispered, That's a $500,000 life insurance policy. She didn't even know if Nan was still paying for it. Good Lord. She set it off to the side and kept going. There were several receipts Scott would likely want, but she didn't even know if he had those pieces or not. She also had that stack of paperwork from Scott that she had just dumped on a shelf in the pantry. And that would be something else she had to organize and label in its own folder. Groaning, she realized once again that just when she thought she was done, she wasn't even close. Definitely needed to scan in those Christie's docs and save them somewhere safe.